Bob Johansen and Jamais Cascio. Welcome to Partnering Leadership. I am thrilled to have you in this conversation with me.
Great to be here.
Glad to be here.
Bob, it's been 5 years since we had our previous conversation on full spectrum thinking. I've referred to your work consistently, episode 56. Now we are almost at 500 episodes.
Wow.
An honor it is to have you with us as well, the person who came up with the idea of BANI. Now, would love to start with you, Jamais. Whereabouts did you grow up, and how did your upbringing help influence who you've become?
I've lived in California my entire life, which in and of itself should be the sentence that explains everything. I am an easily distracted generalist. I started college as an astrophysics major, moved to evolutionary anthropology, and ended up getting a double BA in history and anthropology. Went to graduate school at UC Berkeley to study international politics, and walked away from the dissertation because in the early 90s, they really wanted me to write about the global textile trade regime. And I wanted to write about the impacts of emerging technologies on political power. We went from there to work in the computer field and ended up getting a job at Global Business Network, which was a scenario planning organization founded by Peter Schwartz, Napier Collins, Jay Ogilvy, Lawrence Wilkinson, and Eric Best. Several of those folks worked at Royal Dutch Shell in their scenario group. So I learned the trade there. And of course, then went directly to Hollywood to work on TV shows. When that faded, moved back to the Bay Area to work for an innovation consultancy, which promptly died. And it took me about a year to go from feeling like I was unemployed to feeling, no, I'm a freelancer. And so from there, I went on to do game design, wrote for comic books, done some newspaper, a lot of journalism, a lot of writing, wrote for The Atlantic and the Wall Street Journal. And since 2007, I've done a lot of work with Institute for the Future, never as a full-time employee, but always as someone in their orbit that they knew they could count on. I'd come in and I write scenarios. I do presentations. I've given talks around the world on future-related stuff. Big things have been the participatory panopticon, with something I was thinking about half a decade before the iPhone came out, of what happens in a world when we're all carrying around networked cameras. The cheeseburger carbon footprint, which is to thinking about what's the global climate impact of eating beef. And it turns out it's a lot bigger than you would think. Geoengineering. I actually gave a talk to the National Academies of Science on the politics of geoengineering and was an invited speaker at the first global climate engineering conference. Then in 2018, I came up with the BANI concept: brittle, anxious, nonlinear, incomprehensible. And that's probably going to be the topic that's going to carry me through to the grave.
It is the topic of your book as well, which I can't wait to get to. But before we do, Bob, I would also encourage the audience to listen to our episode 56, which has also been released as a best of episode, still gets downloads all around the world. We talk a lot about your background and upbringing, which resonated very much with my audience as well. So I want to get a different perspective of it. You have continually been for decades a leading thinker and futurist, but you're continuing to rethink and reinvent yourself. What drives you to do that?
Yeah, I think it's curiosity. I'm inherently curious, and I'm interested in the human side. I'm interested in meaning. I went to divinity school before I did my doctorate and before I got into the tech world. I continue to be interested in all things spiritual. Even I'm not an advocate of any brand of religion, but I'm really interested in all the different variations of how we try to make meaning out of life. So I think maybe that's the core of it. Is it keeps coming back to what's going on here, the basic anthropology question. And then how do we derive some meaning out of it? And let me just say about Jamais, he is the best scenario writer I've ever worked with. So Jamais is constantly stretching my mind about possibilities and about how to make sense of those possibilities.
The things that I appreciated in the book, Jamais has that systems thinking and those possibilities. You bring a beautiful leadership angle, and Angela contributes an understanding of the community impact. So, what I'm wondering is the three of you come from it from very different perspectives, background, and experiences. What was most challenging in the three of you aligning around the thinking for this book?
Well, I don't know how it was challenging for me because I'm a steamroller on this. I've been thinking about this specifically since, like I said, 2018. More broadly, the kinds of issues that fed into this, I've been thinking about it for a couple of decades. And working with Bob was the catalyst for actually putting this down on paper. And working with Angela, the challenge was, one, finding time, because she has an incredibly busy schedule, but also being really conscious of the position that I have as a relatively privileged white guy in California, and trying to pay very close attention to what that means and to listen closely to what people from outside of this position have to say.
One of the things I really appreciated, both with the way you approached the Jamais, the value Angela added, and I know Bob and his background do that as well. There's a humanity that comes across. Now, Bob, you had talked previously a lot about VUCA. What told you that VUCA might have possibly run out of road here and we need to focus more on BANI?
So I've been using VUCA as a way of framing the future since 9/11. It's actually a term that's older than that. It was coined in the late 1980s as a way of trying to make sense of the post-Cold War world. So it's actually very useful for quite a long period of time. And I found it very useful, but I did feel I'm not a military guy by background. I just happened to be at the Army War College where it was coined the week before 9/11, and I learned about VUCA. I was with a group of CEOs and senior Deloitte partners. And one of the first things I did with it was try to flip it positive and say, what are ways, if you accept that's the framing, how do you flip it positive? And came up with a framing where volatile yields to vision. So vision would be disproportionately rewarded in a VUCA world. Uncertainty yields to understanding. And I was arguing, and I still argue, that in periods of chaos, you want to be asking questions, not shouting at each other. Complexity yields to clarity. And that's still a message in the BANI future. You want to be very clear where you're going, but very flexible how you get there. And ambiguity yields to agility. And we do have to be essentially corporate athletes or nonprofit athletes or visionary athletes. We have to be very agile in how we deal with this. But my conclusion was, and conversations with Jamais led me to this, my conclusion was VUCA is no longer VUCA enough. That what we're facing is going to be much more chaotic than VUCA. And there's an important underlying assumption that is implicit in VUCA, which is if only we can find the right data, if only we can find the right expert, we'll be able to understand what's going on. And Jamais and I, hours of conversation, years of research, have concluded that may not be the case. And we shouldn't assume that. If it turns out you can understand what's going on, you should get extra credit. So that's great. But you should assume that you won't. But as Jamais says so eloquently over and over again, but we have to decide anyway. We have to decide anyway. So VUCA wasn't VUCA enough. BANI was a very good framing for what's actually going to happen. And then Jamais and I worked together to flip that positive.
I think that is really important as you set the groundwork for why BANI, you do end up, and we will eventually get to the hopeful element of it. Jamais, you describe BANI as the world not behaving. And I was mentioning to you before we started recording that I work with a lot of CEOs and leadership teams. In most instances, there is an event, it could have been COVID, or an election, or something that they say, this is the reason for the chaos. As soon as this is over, we're going to return to a certain level of normalcy. But you describe BANI as the world not behaving. So it sounds like we can't expect to go back to a level of normalcy.
No, because it's not a single causal system. We aren't just driven by an election or by COVID. It's all of these things together. Something we lay out at the beginning of the book is what's been the story of the past decade has been COVID and the political fallout from that around vaccinations and RFK Jr. Has it been Trump and the broader stories of elections and the growing levels of authoritarianism? Has it been the war in Ukraine and the chaos and genocide in the Middle East all over the place? AI. What's been the story? I know some people call it the poly crisis or the omni crisis. I like omni shambles. The one I came up with was the metapocalypse. But it all comes down to the sense that this is not just a single event. This is not just a single through line. In fact, it's woven. And it is something that simply resolving one issue or getting past one issue is not going to make things better. It is a situation where our capacity to adapt is going to be constantly challenged. It's something that I actually posted just earlier today. The past 10 years have really just been practice for the next 25. And all of the things that we write about in the book, all of the things that we are concerned about in terms of this omni crisis will continue to play out and in many cases get worse over the next couple of decades. We're not going to fix the climate. The best we can do in this time frame is stop digging the hole, not make things worse. We're not going to fix global inequality, but we can certainly push back against it. And all of these issues that are far greater than any one group or any one philosophy can resolve. And as we say, these are dilemmas, not problems. They don't have, in many cases, most cases, they don't have solutions. They have responses.
You also focus a lot on leadership. So if BANI is the new reality, what is the mindset shift that you believe leaders need to have right now, Bob?
It's a two-step shift in how we think about leadership. The first step is to accept that something really different is going on. There's always a stage, I think, when you introduce the concept of BANI to people, there's always somebody in the room who says, oh yeah, it's always been BANI, or it's always been VUCA. And that's true to an extent, and maybe beginning from the fact we all have to die at an uncertain time. So yes, there's elements of it that have always been there, but this is really different. And this framing is really different. And we can't assume that if only we find the right expert or the right data, we'll understand what's going on. There is an alchemy at play here. So we need to begin with that assumption. And then the second thing is, in that kind of world, you cannot have certainty. You cannot have certainty. So here, the traditional definitions of leadership, you have to challenge them. If I was asked yesterday in an event talking about the BANI book, what do you advise for a board of directors hiring a new CEO? What question would you ask? And my reaction was, have a meal with them, have lunch or have dinner. You see how they engage in a human way, and then be very attentive to their language. If they use the word absolutely more than once in the lunch, that's not the right person. That's not the right person. There's very few things to be absolute about, but you can be clear. So you look for leaders who are very clear about direction, who understand purpose, understand meaning, and think future back, not just present forward. But you can't have certainty. So in that meal, I'd be looking for clarity. And if I saw strong evidence of certainty, I'd end the conversation.
I would add to that a meal is a really great opportunity to see how the potential CEO interacts with people of lower socioeconomic
Yes,
status and lower level?
that's
Are
very
they
good point.
abusive towards the wait staff?
Yes.
Are they essentially dismissive of them? Or do they interact with them as people? It's actually really remarkable to see how frequently some people treat the people who are serving them in these kinds of situations
Yes.
as garbage. I think that's actually a really critical component. What is the human side of their behavior?
It's so important. When I was running the Institute, I had an office all the way to the back, and there was a receptionist at the front. And when I'd be interviewing job candidates, one of the first things I do after the candidate left was go up and talk to the receptionist and see how they were treated.
That humanity makes a big difference. And as you're mentioning, Bob, there is a need for clarity, seek clarity, avoid certainty. Now, I focused on BANI. The first part of BANI, the B, is brittleness. And you talk about that as the illusion of strength. How would you define the brittleness that we face, and how does that differ from the concept of resilience?
I wrote about resilience for Foreign Policy magazine a decade ago. This is something that's been on my mind. Brittleness, the B in BANI, really arose from the observation of what happens to systems as they come under unexpected pressure. What happens to our economic system, what happens to our political system, and in so many cases, what we think of as being strong systems end up having failure states that are very surprising. And in fact, much of that, it can be driven by a push towards greater and greater efficiency. I think the canonical example of that is plant monocultures in like forestry, where you have a stand of trees or a field of a particular crop that aren't just a single species, but are actually clones of a particular individual that has a really great output in terms of wood density or in terms of the fruit that it produces. And that's great. That can be really efficient and profitable. And then it gets hit by a fungus that just that one particular narrow set of genomes or a narrow set of genes responds to, and you've wiped out that entire stand of trees. You've wiped out that entire field because you have no variation. It's a monoculture. Again, so what we see time and again are these processes that push us towards efficiency, the just-in-time manufacturing, the kinds of production and management processes that push towards getting the most out at the lowest cost as fast as possible when they work beautifully, when they fail catastrophically. And we can see this across a spectrum of economic areas and political areas and human areas. And so the B in BANI, that brittleness, is really about the systems that we depend upon that we need to be strong, but they so often get pushed past their limits or get converted into something that can break far too easily. And resilience then is at the core of the bendability. That's our response to the brittleness.
Wouldn't that then run counter to whether it's the private equity approach or the way the incentives of many executives and CEOs in organizations are currently structured? So what you're saying
Yes.
makes sense, but that
Yes.
runs counter to the way we are incentivizing, whether it's executives in organizations or when private equity comes in and takes over the organization, they streamline and make it a heck of a lot more efficient, but
Yeah.
make it more brittle, as you just mentioned, Jimmy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's a real issue. And that's why future back thinking is so important. And in a BANI period, if we can extend our period, we normally think at least 10 years ahead and then go future back. In our search for clarity, we also go at least 50 years back because almost nothing happens that's truly new. And almost everything that happens was tried and failed years before. So with a 60-year time frame, you can start to get some sense of what's going on. And the higher you go in an organization, the further out they should be looking. And that's just not the case with so many boards of directors. They're just not taking that longer view. And that long view is so important. I think the future back view. So if you can think about this situation, so flipping brittle positive, what we say is you have to be bendable, but not in a wishy-washy sense, bendable within the envelope of clarity, resilient clarity, and that's got to be expressed in a story. So you really want with leaders, great leaders are always great storytellers, and the story should reflect over and over again in a compelling way, affect that direction of change, that meaning, that purpose. And that's really important in order to build in the resilience. And I got to meet Peter Drucker, the great management guru, a couple of times in his later life, and he was in his 90s. And I met with him a couple of times with a CEO of a big company. And the interesting thing that I just take away from that wonderful experience with him, he was still going strong at 94. He was worth listening to. And what he said was, efficiency is great. That's doing things right. But the real story, the real important game for leaders to be playing is effectiveness. What he says doing the right things. So we're so focused in the world of business in particular, but this also applies in government and nonprofit. We get infatuated with efficiency, doing things right. And that's okay up to a point, but in a BANI world, it starts to get not just inefficient, but dangerous.
Wouldn't in many instances, at least the use of AI, the way it's being currently used and rolled out in organizations, run counter to what you're advising?
Definitely. Most of the applications of generative AI have been focused on efficiency and some of them on automation. And there's this big controversy now about how many jobs will we lose. There will be some jobs that we'll lose for sure. But I listen a lot to Tom Malone from MIT, who has been studying AI for many years. He wrote the book called Superminds. But what he said is the big story is not computers or AI replacing machines. It's people and computers, people and AI, maybe if you call it that, doing things that have never been done before. In the other book that I was co-author of this year, we talk about augmented leadership. And what we say is, yeah, there are cases where efficiency is important and it can work. There are cases where automation is possible. I think we're going to be disappointed in the short run about how many of those there'll actually be. And maybe disappointed isn't the right word. Maybe relieved is the right word. But there'll be some. But the big story, and we haven't really understood this story yet because this is a mysterious technology that we have one word to describe, and it's a bad word. It's a bad term, artificial intelligence. That's the worst term to describe an emerging technology I've ever studied in my 50 years of doing this. Augmented intelligence is better. Generative AI is better. But we really need humility as we think about this tech. And I'm intrigued with it. I use it myself, but I've nicknamed my agent Stretch because I only use it to stretch my thinking. I don't trust it.
It's interesting to me. I've been following the evolution of artificial intelligence, again, big, heavy quotes with that, for quite some time. And up until about 5-6 years ago, there was a joke in the industry that artificial intelligence never works because whenever somebody invents something that works, it gets defined as something other than artificial intelligence. But now it's the flip, where anything that has a vaguely generative aspect or relies on machine learning or relies on a database developed by machine learning gets thrown into this AI rubric. And so when we talk about AI, whether we're talking about it dismissively or encouragingly, we actually need to be really clear about what we're talking about.
Exactly.
Are we talking about language models? Large language models have a very wide set of problems that don't apply to all generative AI systems, don't apply to all machine learning systems. And so being much more specific about what we're talking about, that I think is critical for any conversation we have, good or bad, around the implementation or the development and spread, proliferation, the infection rate of artificial intelligence type systems across the workplace. This is a conversation that Bob and I have quite a bit. I'm not nearly as enthusiastic I don't use large language model AI systems because I don't, for one reason, because I don't trust them, but also because of the way they have been developed has been horribly unethical. I know a lot of people who are artists and writers who have had their stuff swept up into the learning databases for these AI systems for both generative art and generative writing. And I'm just really, I find that very icky, to use a technical term. And so with all of that, I do think that machine substrate learning systems, to be really precise in my language, will be extremely important for that augmentation. Because when we have devices that can enhance the way we think without replacing the way we think,
Yes.
without taking over the writing for us, for example. We see so many examples in the world right now of people using language models that in a way that actually and measurably degrades their thinking. That is horrible to me, especially as we are moving into this BANI future.
Yeah.
Yeah, as we're in a BANI world and it becomes even more accelerated.
Yes.
And so I am extremely hesitant about how much I'm willing to engage with language model-based AI, but extremely hopeful about what can be done with other forms.
So this is a kind of footnote here. If you're co-authoring with somebody, it's a really good idea to have things you don't completely agree on. And this was actually very helpful as we wrote the book, because I was using large language models in the way I use them to stretch my thinking. Again, Jamais was not. And we had fascinating conversations and indeed debates. And I'd like to share one takeaway from a event I did just yesterday with large international group. And I introduced the concept of BANI. And one of the participants says, oh yeah, what you're doing is if you name it, you can tame it. If you name it, you can tame it. And I said, that's really interesting. Yeah. And it applies to what we're talking about with BANI, but it also applies to what we're talking about with AI. It's really disappointing to me that the term AI has thrown around with so many different general meanings that a lot of the conversation about the pros and cons of AI is not really worth having because they didn't define what they mean by AI.
Right, right.
So it's really weird. But with BANI, it's the same issue. If we frame this as an increasingly chaotic future that has these characteristics, we believe that's a better way to frame the future. And you do have a better chance of taming it if you name it correctly. If you name it incorrectly, you're not going to be as future ready and you don't have as much hope about achieving the kind of future you want to achieve.
One of the
I
things
mean,
that's really remarkable about the whole BANI thing is that I came up with it in 2018. I talked about it at an Institute for the Future event, but didn't really make it public until 2020, early 2020, after COVID was starting to spin up. And it immediately took off in the global South, in the developing world, across the developing world. Brazil, India, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, across the global South, people were writing to me and saying, yes, this actually describes what we were experiencing. And it didn't get nearly as strong a reaction in Europe and the United States. Now, there were some folks who were interested, but really, the vast majority of talks that I gave, the vast majority of articles that I've seen written out there come from places that are experiencing this BANI world directly and have been experiencing it for a while. And just to underscore what Bob was saying, names have power. And by naming this in a way that resonated for people, it gave them a way to articulate their experiences in a way that other people could understand and gave them handhold that they could use to try to figure out, what do we do now?
you said in the book, if you are not anxious, you are not paying attention. Now, what I wonder is, how can you hold on to a positive level of that anxiety without shutting down? Because the other
Mm.
extreme of it is, I do see a lot of paralysis as a result of the anxiety.
You do. Yeah, we cite in the book another book, which has one of my favorite titles. The other book is written by Robert Rosen, psychologist, and what it's called Just Enough Anxiety. Just enough anxiety. And his point is that anxiety itself isn't bad. In fact, anxiety is good to prepare yourself for challenges of all kinds. But chronic anxiety is very dangerous and psychologically really challenging. But it helps, again, to name it. Anxiety is really future oriented, depression is past oriented. But anxiety is worrying, what if this happens? What if this happens? What if this happens? And in the BANI future, it begins by naming it. But then we talk a lot about simulation and gaming as a way to tame it, to at least imagine in a low risk way how you might engage with this very chaotic future and still be able to thrive in some way or at least cope.
And the human side of that we really also make a point of emphasizing is just the importance of empathy with people around you who are dealing with this anxiety.
Yes.
And they may be dealing with a great deal of anxiety, not because they're imagining a set of future possible problems, but from what they're experiencing in the here and now. And this is actually, for me, was one of the first things that struck me as being critical to how you respond to a BANI world. So simply human empathy, listening to what people are saying about their lives. To whatever degree you can, working with those people to see whatever bigger picture they can, to support them, and just really just listening. It's so critical for me, I think for Bob, certainly for the world at large, to have more empathy for people who are dealing with trauma.
Yes.
Because this world, as it becomes more BANI, becomes more traumatic for a lot of people.
Yeah, and it's really important. I agree completely. It's really important in that situation to be humble as we talk. So I think you'll see with both Jamais and I, and with Angela too, we're humble futurists. We're not telling people what to do. We're not approaching this in an arrogant way to make people feel stupid. We're approaching it in an empathetic way.
One of the phrases that I often use in giving a talk is, as a futurist, I know I'm going to be wrong. The scenarios I create, the forecasts that I create are going to be wrong in different ways. My goal is to be usefully wrong.
Usefully wrong.
That is, even if the details are off, it still provides a provocation. It flips the way you think. It is an epiphany engine of a sort, a way to get you thinking differently about what might happen next.
So I heard two things that I want to go a little deeper on. One is that to counter the anxiety, there is a need for that attentiveness, emotionally being present, listening deeply. Interestingly enough, I find that as executives are more anxious, they do less of that. We tend not to do as well with focusing on others when we become more anxious. The other thing that you mentioned that I want you to share some thoughts on is you mentioned a certain level of future and or scenario planning that doesn't have to be exact, will not be, you will get it wrong, but it helps address some of the anxiety. Would love for you to talk a little bit more about those two aspects. One is the personal level. As we are more anxious, we tend less to focus on others. And then on the organizational level, the need for a level of scenario planning and future thinking and the roles they play in overcoming that anxiety.
I think a lot of this goes back to how we've been taught to lead. And for a long time now, we've looked for leaders who are fast moving problem solvers. And they get rewarded, as you said earlier, Mahan, they get rewarded for producing results quickly and deciding quickly. And in the BANI world, that gets really dangerous. So you want to have a kind of ability to engage with challenges that are not necessarily problems you can solve. So if you're not sure whether your challenge is a problem you can solve or a dilemma, which can't really be solved, but it can be improved, so it can be managed. If you're not sure if it's a problem or a dilemma, you're better off assuming it's a dilemma. Because if you get down the road and you can solve it, you get extra credit because it's a problem. And yeah, this is a problem. I thought it was a dilemma, but it's a problem. But what you need to do if you're facing a dilemma and you don't know exactly what to do, that's the time you should pause and listen. And we consciously do this in our development of people at the Institute for the Future is we want people who have deep academic knowledge, deep breadth across different ways of dealing with that knowledge. But we also want people who fail gracefully at the edge of their knowledge. And the way you fail gracefully, if you don't know what you're talking about, what can you do? The worst thing you can do is pretend that you do. That's the worst thing. The best thing to do is, as Jamais was saying, ask questions, be humble and understand and say, I don't know exactly what's going on here, but I'd like to map that out. Create models, create scenarios about how it might be going, and essentially chunk the challenge into ways you can start to make sense out of it. But don't set up unrealistic expectations about solving and engage with it as you go. And it's just unfortunate, I think, with a lot of people and a lot of leaders is that when there's silence, instead of listening, they talk. And talking your way out of it is not necessarily a good way to proceed. And it might be a dangerous way to proceed.
I often use an analogy when I talk about scenarios and foresight, an analogy of a vaccination.
Yes.
So you think about the way a vaccination works is it essentially, it gives your body a little sample of a particular pathogen so that your body becomes sensitive to it, recognizes it. You know, even whether or not you encounter that pathogen in the time down the road, you are ready for it if you do. Similarly, what foresight and what scenarios provide is a kind of sensitivity. It gives you that distant early warning about a possible futures, possible outcomes that may not actually happen, but if they do, you can recognize it early and actually begin to figure out your responses. And this actually encourages you to think about more than just a single official future or a good future, bad future. I once did an engagement with the head of an internet services company way back in 2000, 2001. And when we presented some possible future issues, we're not even going to talk about that because if that happens, then we shut down. And they simply did not want to entertain a fairly broad set of challenges that were very realistic because they just assumed that if that happens, then we're dead, rather than it's something that we have to figure out how to work with. And so what scenarios in the work that I do, what scenarios offer is a way of seeing different possibilities that you hadn't considered before, thinking about the ways that seemingly disparate dynamics interact. That the whole point of a scenario is not just to say, let's think about the future of X, Y, Z, and just look at that line. Instead, it's to think about how does the future of what we're concerned about interplay with the future of climate, of machine intelligence, of changes in energy systems, whatever the kinds of broader issues that might interweave with the topic that you're focusing on, and to move away from thinking about a single possible outcome, and instead to think about a breadth, to open up your possibility space as to what might happen. And what I have found is that in getting people, leaders of organizations, just people in your community to think about a wider possibility space, a more open cone of possibility, does a really good job of helping them to not get rid of the anxiety, but to contextualize it.
Yes.
To think about, okay, this is something I'm concerned about. How does it fit in with this broader set of issues that we're going to be working with? Is there a way that I can use some of these other developments to help ameliorate the issue that's giving me the greatest trouble?
Yes. One of our colleagues, Jake Dunnigan, likes to say it's better to be surprised in a simulation than to be blindsided by reality.
This is such a powerful practice, Jamais and Bob. Now, I have seen it done somewhat effectively in the military setting. Special forces do a brilliant job of that. But a lot of leaders in organizations don't do as much of it for a couple of reasons. I find a level of the desire to be optimistic, to have this is our vision of the future, therefore we are going to make this a reality, overcome the possibility of having conversations around potential different futures.
Mm.
And I find it requires a certain level of pause to be able to do that effectively. So would love to get your thoughts for the audience that is listening, CEOs of businesses, nonprofits, organizations. How would you approach this? Is this a once a year retreat where you sit down and you talk about potential future scenarios? How would you actually operationalize this in the organization?
It has to be an ongoing practice to work. And the essence of what we do at the Institute for the Future, and Jamais and I have done a lot together, is the cycle we call Foresight Insight Action, where you're creating foresight, not to predict, but to provoke insight. And your goal is to use these scenarios, these mind-stretching experiences, to provoke insight that leads to better decisions in the present, and then recycles to alter your view of the future. So you get an increasingly sophisticated future. So over the years, there used to be very specialized futures groups in large companies. They used to be large, mathematical, and arrogant. And a lot of them went away because they just didn't show value. But that discipline of foresight, insight, action, that's what you want to create as a leader, and networked groups to support that. We have training programs now at the Institute that teach people how to do scenario planning and design futures and augmented intelligence, 3 horizons, teach you basically how to be a futurist. But you got to learn that. But then the important thing is not just the method, it's the practice, the repetition over and over again. And the good thing is it's fun to do, and the methods are known, but they take practice.
It also requires that you have leadership of an organization willing to listen to contradictory narratives. I once did a project with the CIA Center for Climate Change and National Security. It was around the possibility of geoengineering. It was a really big event, multi-day event. We were working out a future set of scenarios. And then Congress shut them down because they didn't like the stories they were getting. And I've seen this so many times working with everything from governments to companies to NGOs and nonprofits, of where what we come up with, the really insightful, sharp things that we come up with in the futures work doesn't match the story that the CEO or that the leader is telling himself, usually himself or herself. And they just give a polite thank you and put the report up on a shelf, figuratively or literally. And unless the leader is willing to be wrong, is willing to listen to ideas that differ from what he or she expected or what he or she assumed, then the foresight work is not going to be useful. It's just going to be put on a shelf.
What a powerful point there, Jamais, that you and Bob made. And it takes that humility that Bob was talking about earlier as well, which becomes a real leadership superpower and critical in this BANI future. Now, we talked about the brittleness, the anxiety, and is nonlinearity. And to a great extent, that breaks our sense of control.
Especially for problem solvers, because problems are usually a linear process and you approach them in ways and you expect what will happen, and generally it does. In a nonlinear system, you have to teach your brains new tricks. And to me, this is the good news element of BANI in the sense that we have all these methodologies for improvisation that have been developed for years and years. And gaming is a kind of improvisation too. But this idea of improv, and we work with a group that's part of the Second City in Chicago. They now have a corporate comedy group that teaches improv. So you can both have fun and learn improv. But most of the groups we work with now, the really good teams, they're working with us for strategic foresight. And they're also working with some other group. It could be Second City. There's lots of different theatrical improv groups. There's lots of different conflict resolution improv groups. But do improv at the same time you're thinking about responding in a resilient way to the BANI future. Improv really helps us get more comfortable being uncomfortable.
Nonlinearity is something that is in many ways is disproportionality. It's in disproportionality in scope, in time. I talk at length in the chapter about climate hysteresis. It's basically the lag between cause and effect in climate change. There is at least 5 years, possibly as long as 20-year lag between changes in levels of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and changes to temperatures and rainfall, which means that both in terms of adding stuff, you don't see the effect of adding a bunch more greenhouse gas for another decade or more. But it also means you can make changes, beneficial changes, reducing or eliminating greenhouse gas emissions, and things will continue to get worse over the next 5, 10, 20 years because of that lag. And so for me, when talking about nonlinearity, what I'm talking about is trying to adjust your mind to thinking not just in terms of that linear, immediate cause and effect, obvious cause and effect, but to recognize that sometimes a great deal of effort can have minimal outcome. An offhand comment can have massive implications. And the disproportionality of power and the number of people who have power can make things really difficult. And so this neuroflexibility that we talk about with positive BANI, this improvisation, really comes down to being clear about what the reality is in the moment and responding to what you see rather than what you have come to believe and expect.
Bob, you've said story is strategy. In what ways can stories help us make sense of this incomprehensible world that happens as a result of nonlinearity?
The reality is the neuroscientists have now taught us that our brains are wired for stories. And if they don't hear stories, they make them up. They make them up. So we don't really have any choice as leaders. We got to be great storytellers. We just need to tell the right stories. So a lot of our BANI book here is about helping you tell better stories, more accurate stories, more profound stories, more stories that will help provoke useful behavior and make it less likely that you'll do things that are less useful. But storytelling is the medium. It's the medium we have to get into. And in this case, the I in BANI is linked to interconnected. But essentially, who do you ask? Who are the experts that you ask to tell the stories, to tell which stories? And that's really where you can come up with the direction that then becomes the resilient clarity story for this whole operation of the way the subtitle of our book is sense making in a BANI future that doesn't make sense. So we're not promising that the whole story is going to make sense, but you gotta somehow tell a story that is valid in terms of at least keeping us from doing more harm and in the good days for creating a better future.
And the story doesn't end. That you don't just tell a single story and that's it. This is an end. These are iterative stories. You build on what stories that people have told before. You come up with your own stories or sets of stories, and they don't end. You learn from what people have said before. You learn from what you have said before and where it has deviated from reality and where it has interwoven with reality in a really critical and meaningful way. And you keep telling stories. It's not a single one-off event. It's an ongoing, iterative, never-ending process.
Yes. And the definition of a story that we like is emotionally enhanced attention. And it's actually the same definition that our colleague Jane McGonigal uses to describe a simulation or a game. It's emotionally enhanced attention. In a game, you actually get to be in the story. You can be in the story, but it's the same medium, really. So there has to be kind of elements of a great story, characters that are attractive, attention, all those things that go into good fiction, go into a good story. But it has to be a story that aligns with your own clarity, your own direction in the face of this chaotic future.
So it sounds like the demands on leaders are drastically shifting as a result of us being in this BANI world. What do you see as the leadership capabilities that it takes to be able to lead well in this BANI future?
So we have a whole chapter on that, and we could spend a whole session on that. But there are some basic human characteristics here, the ability to listen, the ability to tell great stories. Those are not new. But I think there are aspects of this future that are different from, say, a more linear problem-solving world to a more chaotic, nonlinear world. So yeah, there are some differences. There are also some tools and media, like digital tools and digital media or gaming. Those are things that leaders have to be savvy about now. And the point I'd like to make about that is that here's where cross-generational leadership can come in. I think young people who grow up with gaming, young people who grow up with digital media, they're going to have a competitive advantage over us. Even though Jamais and I got involved in digital really early in our lives, for me, it wasn't till I was a PhD student at Northwestern. So I was in my late 20s, where kids, if you grow up with it, it's different. So I really look in the teams I work with, I look for cross-generational, where the senior teams should not just be older people. It shouldn't just be age. There should be a mix generationally in particular. That's an important kind of interconnectivity. So yes, it is new, but the chapter makes the point that some things don't change, and you should ground yourselves in those kind of essence of being a good human and then learn the new stuff.
Being a good human. I sometimes wonder if organizations should be looking to the humanities, people who are trained
Yes.
in theater and English and history. I think that it might be easier to train humanities majors to be business leaders than it is to train people who are business degree majors to be human. Sometimes it feels that way. For me, the leadership qualities that we see flowering in the interconnected positive BANI element is that willingness to listen, the willingness to hear diverse perspectives, not just hearing yes men. It's listening to people that you disagree with. Sometimes they're going to be wrong, but often they will provoke you to think in a slightly different way, to get a different shading, a different perspective on an issue. One of the things that I really admired about Global Business Network when I worked for them back in the 90s was that they had a policy of bringing in really disconnected people from whatever industry or subject matter for their clients. So you're talking to a products and service company, bring in writers, bring in musicians, bring in people who are orthogonal in their thinking, who think in a really different way, not because we think that Peter Gabriel or William Gibson's going to have some brilliant insight into the nature of selling soap. But what they will be able to do is tell you about how people engage with each other how people engage with their materials and brands even, and will provoke you into thinking new ways. And that's the underlying crux of the interconnected chapter is just really, how can you expand your circle to bring in more people who think in different ways to help you see all dimensions of your issues?
Yes. Yeah, it's interesting. I remember those days at Global Business Outward. I think they called them remarkable people. Remarkable people. When we're doing custom forecasts now for big companies, when we're reviewing the forecast, we use the term credible edgies. We want people who are credible in the sense they're listened to, but they're edgy. They just don't fit in the usual pattern. They're typically younger, but at least they're different. They play the edges. And in a BANI future, playing the edges is really important, although it's also important to understand the center in the sense of the meaning or the purpose. But the edge players are the ones who can provoke. And Foresight is designed to provoke insight, to lead to decisions. It's interesting. People are often asked with us, they're asked, I know you're a futurist. How have you done over the years? And the Institute really does keep track. And roughly since 1968, we're the longest running futures group left, I believe. And roughly 60 to 80% of our forecasted futures have happened. But that's not how you evaluate a futurist. That's how you evaluate a fortune teller. So the way you evaluate a futurist is, does our forecast provoke your insight that leads to a better decision in the present? And some of our forecasts, we hope they don't happen.
Yeah. That's actually one of the things about being a futurist, being a foresight professional, is avoiding the anxiety and depression that arises from seeing what might happen and just how likely it is that some of these things might happen. I mean, Bob just said that 60 to 80% of the things that IFTF talked about have come about. That doesn't mean that they were listened to and that they were things that we wanted to see come about.
Exactly. And sometimes the definition of happened is debatable.
Bob, I absolutely loved the book for many different reasons, whether it was with VUCA, Bob, and now with BANI, Jamais and Bob, you've done that, where it's not just what we are feeling, the brittleness, the anxiety, nonlinearity, the incomprehensibility. It's the fact that there is a positive potential that comes from each one of these. And it's up to us as leaders to make that positive potential a reality. Where can the audience follow your work, find your book, and also any other resources, including the Institute for the Future, whose work is outstanding and I follow as well?
ageofbani.com. AGEOFBANI, ageofbani.com. It's basically a clearinghouse for the videos that we've made on explaining BANI, links to our biographies, how to get in touch with us, and links to where to get the book. It really is the center of being able to understand BANI. And I frequently write on Medium, and I'm active on LinkedIn. And the reality is that you can find us pretty easily just by looking.
I so appreciate the conversation and your book, Navigating the Age of Chaos, a sense-making guide to a BANI world that doesn't make sense. I really appreciate you coming back on the podcast, Bob Johansen, and Jamais. Such a joy having you as well. Thank you so much for the conversation.
Thank you very much, Vlad. Very happy to have been here.
Yes, indeed. Great to see you again.